largest transnational crime in the world. And that should be shocking to you. It comes after money laundering, drug trafficking, and illegal arms trafficking, okay? I'm surprised that human trafficking doesn't fall in there, but it obviously doesn't. So why do people steal art pieces? And the whole thing is they don't steal it so that they can go into a beautiful basement room and sit on an oriental carpet and stare at these paintings. Most of these paintings are stolen to be collateral for other crimes. If you wanted to start a drug trafficking ring, you would need money, okay? So where would you get the money? You wouldn't go to Chase Bank and say, hey, you know, I'm gonna start this drug trafficking ring and I need a loan. You would go on the dark web to people who would loan you money. But in order to, and you know this if you've ever had a loan, you have to have collateral. And so the collateral is these art pieces, and many of these art pieces that have been stolen are stored somewhere in a warehouse, will never be seen again because they're never, unless somebody, you know, breaks into a warehouse or somehow finds these serendipitously, but otherwise they're not going to be found, and that's really a shame. So why is it, and this is on the increase, the only thing that I know of that is more lucrative or more common than stealing art pieces is stealing diamonds. These huge, enormous diamonds that they find and they put on display, they're almost always stolen for some. And the same galleries that display these diamonds in jewelry stores, for instance, please, on the Riviera are hit time after time after time, which is amazing to me. So, but art is there. The price tag they put on this is about $6 billion a year, and I think that that's very underestimated because they're not factoring in what is going on with art destruction in wars such as the ones in the Middle East. Why is it so much easier to do this now? Well, first of all, you have cell phones. Cell phones make all these kinds of things easier. You have the dark web. You have, in Europe, because of the European Union, we don't have borders anymore, okay? Shipping things is much more efficient today than it ever was. So because of all of those changes, and changes in tariff laws and whatnot, now that there have to be tariffs on these goods, this makes the whole thing easier, okay? So think about it. So forgeries include lots of things, such as paintings. It can be money, it can be documents, it can be tapestries, it could be books, documents. You know, I have a copy of the Gettysburg Address with Abraham Lincoln's notes on it, right? Maybe. So, but you can do that. So what is a forgery? A forgery basically, because we have to think in terms of what's the difference between a forgery and a restoration. Think about the Sistine Chapel. Okay, Sistine Chapel was restored and they finished it in 1994. It took years. How many brush strokes up there belong to Michelangelo? Not many. But it's restoration. They didn't say, hey, you know, the guy on the scaffolding, that's Michelangelo. No. Okay, so you have to, there has to be a determination to deceive with a forgery. Okay, so, what about that painting you found in the attic? Okay, because this is, you know, I actually did this lecture where people told me that they found things in their attic and they took it to a place like Christie's, they took it to an auction house to see if it was worth anything. I almost fainted when they told me that. It's like, I never thought I would run into a person who actually that would apply to. All right, come on. Okay, so, all right, provenance. Now, provenance is, if you're into like CSI and those crime shows, you know about chain of custody. If a piece of evidence is picked up at a crime scene, it gets a tag, they put a case number on it, and everybody who touches this thing has to fill out a document, and it tells where it was picked up, what it is, who handled it, where it went, and so on and so on and so on until it gets to court. Well, a provenance is the same thing for a piece of artwork, except that it's telling you who painted it, who sold it, who bought it, what museum, what gallery, blah, blah, blah. So that's provenance. And if you're buying something, like if you go to Christie's, let's say you win the lottery and you decide you're going to start an art collection. So you go to one of the big auction houses and you want it, there's a painting that you must have, okay? Well, don't buy it if they don't give you a provenance. And provenance is a problem now for museums who are collecting artifacts from the Middle East. Because all that stuff that was looted from museums, where did it go? Amazingly, a lot of it was returned. A good percentage of it was returned because people, it was just ordinary people who were running into museums and walking off with this stuff, and then they went home and their mother slapped them in the head and said, put that back. And they did, they put it back, but there's still a lot missing. So where do museums go to find artifacts? Maybe to legitimate dealers, but also maybe to the black market. And where did the provenances go? Provenances were stolen, but not connected with the art pieces. So that's a problem. And museums, we also know, we will find out eventually that museums, 20%, it's estimated 20% of stuff that's in museums is not authentic. 20%, yeah. What about that Mona Lisa? No, she's authentic. So you all know about the Antiques Roadshow. Save the boxes, okay? If you have something that you bought, save the box. If you bought that Barbie doll, hope you have the box, okay? Because then it's worth more. I thought that was crazy, but. Okay. Oh, we just talked about that. 20% fake. Okay. All right. I think this is an interesting quote. This is a man who wrote a book called Why Fakes Are the Great Art of Our Age, which is an interesting way of looking at it. It says, no authentic modern masterpiece is as provocative as a great art forgery. Fakes are arguably the most authentic of artifacts. You see, artifact is like, there's a little shade of difference when you say artifact, because artifact is something that's held by culture, okay? So it could be a fake. To discover what the ancient Egyptians or Romans lied about and what they didn't is to penetrate the inner sanctum of their values and beliefs. Okay, so that's an interesting way of looking at it. So this is why some art forgeries and some fakes and some reproductions, if you will, are considered to be important and are valuable. Now, one of the things that inspired me to get an interest in art forgery was an exhibit that they had at the, please sit down, an exhibit that they had at the Metropolitan. I was teaching forensics at the time. I had a really nice class, and I thought, what a treat, I'll take them into the city and we'll go see this exhibit. And the exhibit was on Rembrandt. The Metropolitan has a very nice collection of Rembrandts. Rembrandt was different from many artists because during his lifetime he was famous, he was successful. He didn't have to wait to die to be successful. So what happened was, because he was so successful, he got a lot of commissions to do paintings of people. So what happened in those days is you got a commission, you went to the person's house, the person sat, they got all dressed up and they sat. And he took preliminary sketches, and then he would go back to his studio, do a little work, come back to the person, show them again, so on and so forth. And then what he probably did, because he had too much work, he had more than he can handle, was he took it to his studio. Now, who was in his studio? His apprentices. And apprenticeships they are very important in the art world, okay? So his apprentices, probably because they learned his techniques, how he made those pretty lace collars and all that kind of stuff. And so they could do it, and they would finish the work for him, and then he would sign it. So which ones of those art pieces were Rembrandt, and which ones were Charlie Apprentice? okay? So what they did in this exhibit, which I loved, was they showed how they could look at a painting and tell whether or not it was authentic. So I love that. The kids like the exhibit too, which is always a plus. So, is it possible to limit fakeries? Yeah, it's possible because the museums really need to be more careful. There's so much science involved now that they can authenticate. However, it's very costly. It's very expensive to do any of these tests. And there are companies that they do just that. Just consider the idea of taking, I'll use the Shroud of Turin. You all know about the Shroud of Turin. It was the linen that supposedly was wrapped around Christ's body after he was taken down from the cross. Okay, well, it's linen. It's an organic substance. So you can tell how old it is by carbon dating. But carbon dating involves very sophisticated scientific equipment. So therefore, you know what an MRI costs if you break your leg or whatever. So this is very expensive. Is the museum going to go through all that? If they have a provenance, fake or not, maybe they're not going to do that. Okay, so there's that. The public also needs to be educated about what they will accept. But you go into a museum and how do you tell whether something is authentic or not? Fakeries or forgeries or copies are not easy to control simply because apprentices do them. Apprentices will probably more than likely pick a school of artists or one artist and learn how to copy them. And then there is a big market out there for copies. Okay, so I'm the head of a shipping company, and I have this beautiful office overlooking New York Harbor, and I want some pictures. Okay, so I want those copies. So which one of those copies, I could say I'm honest, it's a copy, it's not, and I have a provenance that said it was done by somebody in a studio, but suppose somebody comes into my office and steals it, and then tries to sell it as the real thing. So it's very hard to control this whole situation. Okay, so let's see what kind of a art forger you can make. What do you have to consider if you're going to forge an art piece, okay? You have to consider the canvases and the frames, all right? You have to think about the paints and the other chemicals. You have to consider the style. You have to consider whether or not you have to subject this piece to an aging process. I mean, if you're going to make forgeries out of pieces from the Renaissance, I suggest you do not go to Michael's for your supplies because they're going to figure it out right off the bat. Okay? And credibility. When you create this piece, how credible is it that it's a piece from the Renaissance?
Zip zero.
It looks like a Picasso. It's probably not. So you have to know about it. You have to know. If you're forging pieces, you have to know about the school of art that you're forging the piece from. So there's all of that. So think about it. I suggest that you go with modern. All right, this is a list of some of the techniques that are used to authenticate an art piece. And I'm going to go through them all so you don't have to read them. But some of them are easy to understand and others are crazy. But first of all, I'm going to take this beautiful picture, which is called La Bella Principessa. It originally was called Portrait of a Young Girl in Profile. And there was an art, I guess you would call him an agent. He was an agent for a very wealthy collector. His name was Peter Silverman. And he would go around to galleries and he would look at art pieces. And he looked at this piece and they said that it was painted in the 18th century. And that it was this lovely girl. And he's looking at it and it's charcoal and pastel on wood. Okay, he's saying, no way, this is older. So he buys it for $22,000 in this gallery. Okay, and then he takes it, because his patron is so wealthy, he takes it to a place called Lumiere Galleries in Paris. and they do all of these tests. So the first thing they do is they do a carbon dating test, and they find out not 1800s, this goes back to the 1400s. Ooh, Renaissance. Doesn't that make more sense? Chalk, pastel on wood. Lots of times they just use canvas. So then what they did was they digitized the painting. That means that you can look at every tiny little piece, all those pixels. And they notice a fingerprint. They notice two things. They notice something called hatch marks. So you're a painter and you're right-handed. Your strokes are going to go like this. But if you're left-handed, they're going to go like this, right? The only left-handed painter of any note during the 1400s is Leonardo da Vinci. Oh. So then they have this fingerprint. They find his fingerprint. And lo and behold, they have on record, they have in their archives a fingerprint from Leonardo da Vinci, because obviously he was a sloppy painter. He was noted. If you want to read about Leonardo da Vinci, you have to read Isaacson's book. I mean, it's like this thick. You really have to love it. And he is the only left-handed painter they know of. They checked the fingerprint. It was, I think, a partial thumb and palm, and they check it against what they have, and it's a match. Then the other thing, because when you do all these scientific tests, you also have to deal with the art historian. And the art historian is very well respected. He is the bottom line, or she is the bottom line. And so what they bring out is the fact that Leonardo da Vinci was a disciple of a man by the name of Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman architect, and what he did was he had a whole school of architecture where he determined what the proportions should be for a building for it to be pleasing to the eye, as well as a face. How deep the forehead should be in relation to the size of the nose, etc. All of those relationships were Vitruvian, and Leonardo da Vinci was a disciple of Vitruvius. So it's Leonardo da Vinci, and then the price on it is $150 million.
Oh, wow.
Turned a nice profit, right? This is like flipping houses. No. Okay, so Vitruvius. Where is he? What do I do with him? Tell me I don't have Vitruvius here. Nope. He'll come. The Vitruvian man is the guy they send into space.
Yeah.
He's like this. So the aliens could recognize us when they saw us and ran, probably. Okay, so all right, here we go. All right, so we'll talk about all of these different methods that are used by both the art historian and the scientist. First, we have stylistic analysis, which is pretty much what I just talked about. All artists have a particular style. I mean, many Americans really love Impressionist paintings, and we know what that style is. It's called painterly. Slapped a lot of paint on that canvas, and then let's move that paint around. And that's a style. So you're looking for that style. Picasso, you could recognize a Picasso simply by not only the style, but also something called iconography. But that's up to the art historian. This is not really scientific. Iconography is a lot of artists will always put certain symbols in their paintings. There was a cartoonist who used to draw cartoons for, it was the Herald Tribune, before the Herald Tribune went out of business. I can't remember his name. Hirschfeld. And he would draw these cartoons, these massive cartoons with lots of people, very famous people, but he'd always put his wife in there. So that was his iconography, all right? So we look for those kinds. If you have ever seen the Chagall paintings in the Metropolitan Opera House in the Lincoln Center, there's two big ones as you walk in, and there's always icons from Jewish religion and history. So that's what we mean by iconography. That's just a silly cartoon that I put in there for God knows what reason. Okay, so that's two people in jail for art forgery. One is copying or forging. The guy on the bottom is forging the guy on the top. The guy on the top is forging the guy on the bottom. It's silly. Anyway, enough of that. Okay, so let's start with canvases and frames. Okay, sometimes if you find that painting in the attic, the frame could be more valuable than the painting. Okay, but if we want to talk about, is this authentic? What we're going to do is we're going to look at that frame and let us say that we think that frame goes back to, all right, the Renaissance or maybe the 15 or 1600s, okay? You're not going to have the frame put together with staples, okay? They're going to be put together with wooden dowels. We can also scrape some of the paint off and we can chemically analyze the paint because paint has changed over centuries. I once listened to a lecture by a nun who was an expert on illuminated manuscripts. You know, like the Book of Kells, the beautiful pages from the Bible that all the monks did, and they put the flowers and birds and gold letters and all that. She was an expert in analyzing the paints, you know, on those illuminated manuscripts. And I found it fascinating because it opened up the whole door to me of how chemical analysis is so important in this field, because you can actually chemically analyze the paints on a canvas. For instance, in the Renaissance, painters were famous for their colors, and they made their colors from lots of toxic materials and ground up minerals. Like blue, they would take lapis lazuli and they would grind it up and it would make blue, or they would take a mineral called cobalt, a compound of cobalt, and that would make blue. Titian red, and then there was Chinese purple, and what's the other one? There's another one. White paint, particularly, was toxic in those days. They made it from lead. But they had their own, they mixed their own things. They didn't go and buy it from Rohrbacher. You know, they never went to Michael's. No. Oh, also the canvases. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just like about the white paint actually. So I was an art education major, and anytime we went to Blick to pick up paint, the professor always told us we couldn't get flake white because that still has traces of lead in it. Was that right? What they told us?
It's possible. It's possible because lead makes a really nice white paint.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were really trying for a particular shade of white, because white comes in shades, probably that was true. Was it enough to kill you? Probably not. You shouldn't. You know, a lot of the monks got sick because what they would do, and this was also true in another field, is they would take the paintbrush, dip it in the paint, and bring it to a point in their mouth. You know, so they were ingesting this stuff over time, and eventually, I mean, the first 6 or 7 times you do, it's not going to make any difference. You have to do this over months, and then it will kill you. Yes.
I think the other part is the teacher in middle school said people in the 1920s they put radium on the watches. That's also it's radioactive, right?
That's exactly what I was going to talk about.
What?
Yeah, you know, the radium watch dolls. When I was a kid, I remember the radium watch dolls. You know, you had a watch, and oh boy, your Mickey Mouse watch, the numbers glowed in the dark.
Is it still used though? It's still used?
No. And because they painted them with radium, and radium is highly radioactive. So, and these women would be. It was also back in the. I guess the age of Dickens, the Victorian times, people worked in match factories, and they would make the matches, and they would also put them in their mouth, and the phosphorus eventually caused their jaws to just disintegrate. Yes.
They would also, around the same time, they put mercury in top hats, and you would sweat in mercury, and you'd eventually go mad. They would call it mad hatting.
The Manhattan. There you go.
Yeah.
And one of the gentlemen who's running for president, actually, one of his physical problems is mercury poisoning.
Is that
and he
right?
attributed to eating a tuna fish sandwich every day. So I guess I'm going to be.
Yeah.
candidate for that, because I love to do it. Anyway.
Alright.
So, but anyway, the canvases, they should have been made from either vellum, which is animal skin, or linen, okay? And, the canvases that you buy in Michael's now are a fabric, but they're treated. They're also treated with a substance which I'm sure was not available back in the 1400s. So you have to look at all of those things. So let's move ahead. Okay, here's lead, okay? And, you can actually use the lead content of paint to tell how old something is. Because the lead that is there is probably the result of the decay of radium, and radium is naturally found with lead. So over time, at a specific rate, the radium will turn into lead. And so there is an instrument called a mass spectrometer which can actually sort out the atoms and tell you what the percentages are, and by knowing that, you can tell how old the paint is. And this, of course, X-rays. Most artists used their canvases over and over again because most artists were poor, okay? But also, if you were Rembrandt and you took your painting over here to your patron, okay, and they looked at this and they said, nah, I don't like this. Change it a little. It's a little too violent. And this is the painting that was on top of it. So, and you're gonna paint things. I mean, if you had a person who wasn't particularly attractive, but they wanted to leave a painting of themselves that was a little better than what they looked like, they'd say, well, fix the nose, you know, the mouth. Give me a little bit more hair, or put a hat on my head, stuff like that. So they would change it, but you would be able to see the history of that by using an X-ray. Isotopes, okay, again, an isotope is a form of an element. Elements are the purest substances that occur on the planet. But all of the atoms of one element, like if we take gold, all of the atoms should be identical, but they're not, because what differs is their weight, okay? And those different forms are called isotopes. They differ only by weight, they have the same chemical properties. So why is this important? Okay, isotopes occur in all natural substances. So if Michelangelo was using marble for his statues, he probably got the marble from Bari, Italy, or someplace in Italy, or someplace in probably northern Italy where the mountains were. And isotopes of the chemicals in that marble, like the calcium or other substances, would have a particular ratio. If you got the marble from Vermont, the ratio would be different. So you can actually isolate a rock or a piece of marble or even paint to a specific area. I don't know if you're familiar with the Iceman, the ice mummy. He was the guy who was found in the Italian Alps. He was frozen. They thought he was a hiker gone astray during a hiking expedition, but when they took a good look at him, they realized he was 5,000 years old. And he's really pretty famous. And in fact, I just saw another article about him because he had tattoos, and they were trying to figure out, how he got his tattoos. But they were actually able to isolate him to a town in the Tyrolean Alps because of the isotopes in his body from the food he ate.
Oh.
So, I mean, this is important. Okay, so, this one I'm not even going to talk about, okay? Morellian analysis is Vitruvius, okay? In other words, Morellian analysis is when you look at the works of a particular artist, you look to see what was his philosophy of painting. So, like for Leonardo da Vinci, his philosophy was Vitruvius and his proportions in making a face that was beautiful. So other artists had other, what do you want to call them, constructs or rules that they would follow when they would make a painting. And that's called Morellian analysis. I think this might be where, and there he is. I knew he was in here somewhere. That's the Vitruvian man. Okay, we've all seen that.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were really into space exploration, this was something that became very popular. Okay, digitizing, well, we already found out how good digitizing is. We can find the brush strokes, we can find fingerprints and God knows what else, probably rat droppings, depending on the studio. And rat droppings can tell you a lot about where it comes from. Okay, so all molecules of pure substances have a signature. And when you're analyzing paint, you're looking for signatures, okay? How do we find those signatures? So we find them by examining the chemical bonds with light, okay? We use something called spectroscopy. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, where if it comes up anywhere in your life's activities. Spectroscopy is used a lot by police labs to identify drugs, because drugs like cocaine, the THC in marijuana, LSD, a lot of different drugs have a particular chemical consistency. In other words, they're pure chemical substances. So by using spectroscopy, which actually uses different frequencies of light, like ultraviolet or infrared, and they subject the substance to it, and they will get a different pattern, and that pattern comes out like this graph that you see. And what that graph is telling me is where the infrared, I don't know whether this is infrared, I can't tell whether it's infrared or ultraviolet, but it will tell you where those frequencies of light are absorbed by the chemical. So you get a pattern, okay? And the height tells you how many bonds there are. So most drugs have 3 kinds of bonds, maybe more. Carbon to oxygen, carbon to carbon, carbon to hydrogen, carbon to nitrogen, nitrogen to hydrogen. They have the 5 different kinds of bonds. And by knowing how many of each of those, you can figure out what the substance is. So here what we're doing is we're using the light to identify chemicals. And this is common now. This is like, it's not, anything new or different. If you went to any police lab, you would see them use that. And these are the rules of chemistry. Most substances are not pure, they're mixtures. In order to analyze substances, you have to separate the mixtures. And we use something called chromatography to do that. There's various ways of doing it. And then we subject the compounds that are pure, or the elements that are pure, to light, and it tells us what they are. So that's as basic as I can get with chemistry. How old is it? Carbon dating. Okay, as long as something is alive, carbon dating can only be used with organic substances. As long as something is alive, it's taking in material. We're either as animals eating things, or as plants, we're performing photosynthesis and making sugar and starch and whatnot. So as long as you're doing that, the carbon in your body is found in 2 forms, carbon 12 and carbon 14. Again, these are isotopes. They're different only in weight, okay? Not in chemical composition. Okay, so that, because you keep taking in new materials, that ratio stays the same. As soon as you die, you stop eating, except unless you're an Egyptian mummy, okay? Because they used to leave food for those people. Yeah. Okay, so what'll happen is the carbon 14 then turns into carbon 12 at a specific rate. So you go back to that machine that separates the atoms, and you have a pile of carbon 12s and a pile of carbon 14, and the ratio of them tells you how old it is. Very clever. I don't know who figured that out, but that was a good one. I hope they got a Nobel Prize for it. Okay. Again, the use of light. Light will interact with all kinds of chemicals. So this is using ultraviolet and infrared light, and you're seeing the picture differently. And it's telling you something about the paint. It's telling you something about the technique. It can also be telling you about what was underneath the painting. How did this face on the left, how did it appear on the canvas? I mean, we have this, she has a nice rosy cheek here, and over here her cheek is blue. Well, what does that mean as far as the artist's style is concerned? Okay, then we use imaging. We no longer unwrap the mummies because they fall apart. So now we image them, okay? So medicine really helps us out a lot. Crack-a-lore. you know, if you have a painting and even if it's not all that old, what'll happen is most artists will seal their paintings. They'll use, back in the old days, they used shellac, they used lacquer. Now they use polyurethane, they spray can, right? And what'll happen is, eventually, no matter what you use, you'll get craquelure. And each chemical substance cracks in a different pattern. So what you do is you take a picture of the craquelure, you put it in a computer, the computer compares it to every possible substance that will produce craquelure, and it says, aha, this painting that you say was painted in the Renaissance was sealed with polyurethane. It's a fake, okay? And then we have chromatography. You've all experienced this. You have a paper towel, it's a little wet, and you're using a pen, and you get a blot of ink on the pen and the paper towel, which is wet. Through capillary action, the ink starts to spread out, and you see, oh, that black ink is really purple and yellow, and right? So that's chromatography. That is the easiest way to separate a dye, and it's used not so much in this simple form to analyze paint. Okay, so we talked about this, right? The Sistine Chapel, the difference between restoration is perfectly, you know, legal and acceptable and good, because great art pieces do suffer from age, and you want them to be restored and renewed. I mean, if you love this subject, you probably read novels by Daniel Silva. Okay, and he has his art restorer. If you haven't read his books, read them. You'll really like them. They're mysteries, and he is an art restorer, and he's also an agent for the Israeli intelligence service. So he gets involved in all these interesting, Gabriel Alon, and you'll like him. But at any rate, he restores paintings. And restoration sometimes just means cleaning it up. Certainly doesn't mean changing it. Famous art forgeries. Okay. Well, this is another Renaissance piece. Okay, it's beautiful. Two things were a problem with it. One of them was the fact that it was painted on wood, and all wood is subjected to wormwood after a time. A worm gets in there and makes these little tunnels. Well, they looked at they imaged it, and they looked at the wormholes, and they were straight. So they were made with a drill, not a worm. And then the blue paint was called Prussian blue, and Prussian blue was not invented until after the date that was originally given for this. So this is a very sloppy person who did this. I mean, it's really pretty, but
It's sloppy.
okay. Michelangelo actually forged a piece. Okay, he made a statue of the sleeping Eros. He buried it in the backyard to age it, and he and his, I guess his agent, his mentor or whatever, they tried to sell it as an antique piece. So even Michelangelo, that was when he was poor. That was before the Pope found him. The Getty Koros, this is a statue that's in the Getty Museum in California. I still don't know whether it's authentic or not. Some say no, some say yes. So, I mean, how could you tell? If you really don't have some kind of scientific evidence or a witness, which is unlikely. Okay. Hans von Neubring, he was the famous art forger, he was my favorite. Why? Because he was able to put something over on Hermann Goring, who was one of Hitler's henchmen, and Hermann Goring was Hermann Goring was an art collector, an avid art collector. He had fabulous. All that art that they confiscated, he got first dibs. He would go to the Jeu de Paume in Paris while they were taking all these artworks from the Jews and other people, and he would say, oh, that. Send it to Corinna Hall in the Bavarian Alps, where he had this magnificent, almost museum. So because this guy was able to sell him the fake, I like him. Because I don't like them. And she's lovely, isn't she? Did you see the movie? Read the book?
Dr. Hanson.
Yeah. And this guy, Elmer the Hoary, even his forgeries go for a good price. Hey, there was on 60 Minutes a number of years ago, there was a married couple, Wolfgang and Helena Bertracci, and they forged Renaissance pieces, and they were arrested and put in jail. They made $14 million from these forgeries that they created, and they were interviewed on 60 Minutes, and they said they were out of jail by this time. They said, no, we're just going to continue. It's too lucrative. Okay. Okay, and these are some of the scams, shall we say. Just the one I like here is art dealer Titania Khan sold a fake Picasso she had commissioned for $2 million. Wow. And I like this one too. A German scamster sold over 200 fake Alberto Giacometti sculptures out of his car. Would you buy an art piece out of the back of somebody's car? I wouldn't even buy a lobster out of the backseat of somebody's car. There used to be a guy on 110 who did that. So, anyway, anybody else? So they're, you know, what can I say?
Steve Martin wants money?
Yeah, poor Steve, I like Steve.
Yeah.
It was ugly. I saw a picture of the painting, it was ugly.
Well,
There's a bunch of horses in the field. Okay, great art thefts. We talked about this one, the Gardner Museum. Some of those pieces have been returned. But these are all pretty decent. And the greatest art crime of all, and that was the Monuments Men. It's the Monuments and Fine Arts Archives. That's what they're called, the MFAA, which is very clumsy. And they were commissioned in 1943 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the reason being was that what was going on in Europe was everything was being destroyed, and there was an effort by the residents of Europe to try to save the art pieces. For instance, the day before the Germans captured Paris, a group of, I guess, employees of the Louvre Museum had gathered up and crated all of the art pieces in the Louvre and were transporting, as the Germans were coming in, they were transporting them out and taking them to chateaus outside of Paris, like in the Loire Valley. And they had to move those paintings several times. The Mona Lisa, one of them. Okay, so the Mona Lisa was saved from, the Germans never got a hold of her. And because they just kept moving them. The same thing happened in Florence. Florence, we know, is another major art capital of Europe, and the same thing happened there, is that the curators and the museum employees crated up everything, and they would take stuff and they would hide it in these rich people's palazzos and out into the country. And sometimes the Germans would find it and sometimes they would not. So the other thing that was happening, these were art pieces from museums, and these were at least saved, but the buildings, the churches that went back to the Middle Ages, the monasteries, these were all being destroyed by not only the Germans, but the Allies. What the Germans did in Florence was pretty awful, because Florence is located on a river called the Arno, and then there are bridges, the famous Ponte Vecchio, across the Arno River. And the Germans, there was actually one of the bridges that was commissioned by Leonardo da Vinci, because he really didn't want to paint, he wanted to build things. He wanted to do his inventions, and he kind of financed it by, by doing his art pieces. But at any rate, what happened there is the Germans blew up every one of those bridges except the Ponte Vecchio. So these were the kinds of destruction that was appalling to most of the world. So anyway, FDR commissioned these monuments and fine art. If you read the book, you pretty much know the idea. The people who went over to Europe were not soldiers. They were curators of museums. These were people who, when they came back after the war, they founded the American Ballet Theater. They were the curators of the most famous museums in the United States. One of them was the founder of the Washington Portrait Gallery. So these were artists, these were art people, these were intellectuals and academics and whatnot, but they went over there and they would go from town to town after the fighting, most of the fighting was over. There were still snipers and it was still dangerous. And they would mark the buildings so that they could be preserved. Most of what they found out was done by accident. One of the things that was going on in France was the Germans were confiscating every piece of artwork that they could find in France, and they were taking it to Paris to a small museum in the Tuileries, it was in the Bois de Boulogne. It was in a big park in Paris, and it was called the Jeu de Paume. And there was a woman working in there. She was a Parisian. Her name was Rose Vian, and she worked with the Germans to catalog. You know the Germans, they're very organized. They cataloged everything. They packed everything. And then they put everything on trains, and they took it east, and they hid it in caves and salt mines. So that's what happened to all of this stuff. How did they find this out? Because the men who went over there, these curators and these intellectuals, they went around and they talked to people, and they found out what was going on. And then they finally convinced Rose Vian. She wasn't going to work with them because she didn't trust them in the beginning. She thought, oh yeah, you're going to steal it and take it to America. That's what they thought these men were going to do. And they said no, because what happened was something called the Wiesbaden Manifesto. And Eisenhower said in this manifesto, he said, you are not to steal the artwork. When you find it, you are to restore it and give it back to who it belongs to. You are not to take it home. Not like my character in my book, who gave it to his friend, which was a good thing. But at any rate, that was the Wiesbaden Manifesto. And isn't that amazing? Because up until then, who gets the spoils of war? The victor gets the spoils of war. So in essence, we should have gotten a whole lot of it, right? If we had the old rules, but Eisenhower said, no. This is the people's culture. We have to restore their culture. I think that was like an amazing, wonderful thing. If you want to feel good about something, that's something to feel good about. So another story was all of this stuff was stored in these salt mines, like in Austria and Czechoslovakia and whatnot. And there was one town in Austria called Altesee. And these men were following all of these leads. And so one of them, his name was Posey, he got a toothache. So he went to the local dentist, and he got to talking to the local dentist because they would tell the people what they were doing because they were hoping to get information. And the dentist says, oh yeah, my son-in-law is working for the Germans now in boarding up these caves with explosives inside because they're gonna blow the whole thing up because they don't want you to have it. So he said, where is this? And he gives them directions to the cave, and they were able to get in there and rescue the cave. And one of the things they did was they put tape across the cave or signs saying, danger, explosives, don't enter. And actually there were no explosives in there. When they found them, they took them out, but then the Germans wouldn't go in there. So they saved an awful lot of stuff that way. But an awful lot of stuff is gone, okay? So, for instance, I don't think I have a picture of it, but let me say. Did you ever hear of the Amber Room?
Mm-hmm.
Here they are. That's from the movie, though. Oh, all right, I'll leave it there. I'm pretty sure I know. The Amber Room was a gift from one of the German kings, Frederick, one of the Fredericks, to the Russians, to Tsar Peter the Great. And amber is petrified tree sap. And it has, the value of it is that it has captured, and this is prehistoric, this amber is petrified from prehistoric. It's captured little leaves, little flowers, little frogs, little insects, little feathers. So you have like a record of who lived at that time. So amber occurs naturally, and it occurs in deposits, you know, under the ground. And one of the places that you find a lot of amber is Eastern Europe and Russia. So what this artist did was he created a room by taking amber, and the amber, the deposits are so large you can actually make a slice of it. So thinking about piles of like plywood. So you would have pieces like that, and they would be all different colors, depending upon their age and what species of tree it was. And so he cut these into designs, and the walls and the ceilings and the floor and every piece of this room, the desk, everything was made of amber, gold, and jewels. This was in the Catherine Palace in St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad at the time. And the Germans went in and they deconstructed it and packed it up, and it's gone. They don't know what really happened to it. There is a theory that it was put on a train and taken to Poland, where it was put on a ship, where it was supposed to be, I don't know where, but the ship was hit by a submarine, by a torpedo, and sunk. They found the ship, and but they ran out of money, and so they can't really like lift the ship or get into the ship to see whether or not, you know, it's like if you saw the movie Titanic, it's sort of like that. And so that's, well, what did they do is they reconstructed, they had the plans from the artist who did this, and they reconstructed the amber room. So it's back there in the Catherine Palace, but it's a restoration. Okay, I think that's an interesting story. And this is a story I think you may know. But before I go there, this is some questions that really come out of a war where valuable art pieces and cultural pieces are destroyed. You know, who owns the spoils of war? Well, it depends on who's fighting the war, right? We decided that it belongs to the people. What else do I want to say here? What's the morality of museums buying stolen art? You know, this is something that we don't know whether some of the stuff that's in a museum is real or fake, because we don't know whether the museum was looking for provenances or really did their homework. What's the cost of searching for this lost art? I mean, how much did it cost the government? Probably not a lot, because the war was going on and these men were moving around with, you know, the army. And how do you weigh paying for restoration and finding art pieces against helping refugees from the war? So there's a lot to think about here. In the Middle East now, in Syria particularly, there are so many refugees that the refugees and some of the ancient sites that are in Syria and Iraq and Iran are still there. They're ruins, but they're cities. And the refugees have no place to go, so they take up residence in these ancient cities, and they're destroying them just by doing that. So, you know, there's a lot to consider as to what goes on in the war as far as art and culture are concerned. Okay, did you ever see this one? Woman in Gold? She's across the street from the Metropolitan Museum in the Neue Gallery. And the Neue Gallery belongs to Austria, okay? All right, so the woman in gold, her name is Adele Bauer, or Bauerbach. I never could get that straight. She had two last names. And she was a very beautiful woman, and she was painted by Gustav Klimt. Gustav Klimt liked to paint pretty ladies, and he particularly liked her. And he had obviously his own unique style of painting. And if you see this painting, you will be astounded by it because it is gold. It's gold leaf. It's so gold that it kind of knocks you over. It's really beautiful. And at any rate, she died, I think in 1920. She died before the war. She got the flu or something. In those days, the flu was all over. And but the paintings were given by Gustav Klimt to her family. And there was a movie made of this, and what happened was, the Nazis came in, the family was wealthy, they had all these art pieces, but the granddaughter escaped with her husband, and her name was Maria Oldman. And she manages to escape by the skin of her teeth and get to America. So she gets to America, and in the 1980s, she begins to realize that these paintings really belong to her family, okay? So, because they are now displayed in the museum in Austria. She says, they're really mine. So what she does is she hires a lawyer, and she brings the suit against the Austrian government, but she loses. They say no. I don't even remember what they said, but then the State Department tells her that there's a loophole about this, the ownership of these paintings, and because of the war, she goes back and she wins. And so she gets the woman in gold, and she takes it back with her, but she's running a little boutique in California. She has no place to hang this thing. She sells it to Estee Lauder's son, Ronald, who was involved in New York politics for a while. He buys it, but she says to him, you cannot not display this. This has to be displayed forever. And so it's in that Neue Gallery. And so go there, see the painting, and have something in the cafe. Have their Windsor tour. It's really good. It's a great place. But this is a wonderful story about art, and that's not a forgery. And every once in a while, I'll bring more of Gustav Klimt's paintings, and you get to see them as well. And they're all mesmerizing, beautiful paintings. So I think that might be the end of this. Yeah. And that's my girl with pencil drawn. That's funny. So, questions? Yes?
Yeah, have you heard of Udet Gulan? I saw a piece about him. He was an Israeli art faker. Did you hear about this? Apparently it was pretty popular. He was faking artifacts with the Israeli museum, but apparently he also worked as a Mossad agent. So it became a really gray area. I was wondering if you ever heard about that.
No.
Okay.
What was his name?
Udet Gulan is his name. Yeah. in
How do you
fact, I
spell
think
his last name?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I remember how to say it, but I couldn't spell it.
Yeah.
Put a gun to my head.
Well, there's
But no,
some-
really interesting story because some of the pieces were legit, some were fake, and he was very bright. He was an art historian, archaeologist, he was on site doing a lot of archaeology. So what he was doing is he was layering the real pieces with the fakes. And he never admitted more than what he got prosecuted for. So there's a lot of museums, especially in the Middle East and Israel, that say we can't really validate if anything we got from him is accurate or not, or authentic or not.
Yeah, well, at least they were honest about it.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the Middle East now is really the hotbed of problems with art right now. Yeah, I thought of one of them, but I can't. There was actually, during the Iraq War, there was a single person, one army man, major, who actually got involved. He was, evidently he must have been reserved because he was sent over there. But because of his rank, he was able to pretty much pick what he wanted to do. And he became the monuments man for Iraq. And, you know, got involved in trying to find all those art pieces that were stolen. But, yeah, we're gonna be living with this for a long time, I think. You know, Antiques Roadshow, I'm surprised some of this stuff doesn't show up. It will eventually. Yes?
Adolf Hitler, I read that a lot of the paintings, he wanted to create his own museum.
Yeah.
But he wanted to get into art school when he was younger, and he would not get accepted.
Yeah, well, that's true. The reason why he was confiscating all these art pieces was because his idea was to build what was called the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria. He was not German, he was Austrian, and he came from Linz, Austria, and he was going to build this huge building. And when he was finished with Europe, he actually had an idea that he was going to move into the Far East, Middle East and the Far East, and take all their stuff too. Because I mean, after all, you know, today Poland, tomorrow the world. You know, so he was going to put everything in this museum.
That was in Austria.
In Austria, Linz, Austria. Yeah, I was there. I drove through there once. Yes.
He was also the, I guess, the main man of the
That's right. That was the other thing. The art pieces that he wanted were particular art pieces. He didn't like everything, capture everything. I mean, he destroyed hundreds of art pieces, and also he started off with a book burning. So, but degenerate art, as far as he was concerned, he didn't like sexual subjects, and he also didn't like anything that had a political theme to it that didn't agree with him. So, a lot of paintings will never be retrieved because he burned them. Yeah, who was it? Like, and yeah, so yes, but that was his plan. The Fuhrer Museum, which I don't even think they broke ground on it, as far as I know, because most of the stuff was, stored where it was, and of course, Germany at that time was being bombed, and Austria not so much, but Germany definitely. He had his hands full, I guess. Anybody else? Yes?
How much was a painting that they sold for $150 million? How much did they buy it for?
Well, and they sold it for 150 million.
Yeah.
Somebody bought it for 150 million, I guess. I don't know who bought it though. I
I
don't even know if, I have to tell you the truth. It was valued at 150 million,
Yeah.
possibly kept by the patron who hired Peter Silverman. You never found out his name. He didn't want to be known. It was Donald Trump. No. He didn't want to be known.
Yeah, because I'm just curious how much they bought it for.
Well, I would think, I mean, I haven't read anything else about it other than the 150 million.
Yeah, and where did they find this again? What is it like at
It was a gallery in New York City.
a gallery in New York City? And they were surprised that it was worth that much.
Well,
Okay,
I mean,
yeah.
the gallery evidently didn't, they may not have had the resources to really authenticate the piece. And so it came with a provenance. Otherwise, either that or they made it up. But I mean, they sold it for 22,000. It was probably a profit for them because they probably bought it for less. But I mean, Peter Silverman just had a very good eye.
Yeah.
And
So they sold it for 22,000, but it was worth 150 million.
yeah, well, he bought it for 22,000, and then once he had it authenticated, it
Yeah.
was valued at 150 million.
Wow.
I
That's a
heard
big
that
deal.
the Italian government wanted that map, saying it belonged to, yes, belonged to them. And I don't know, I mean, does he still own it, or, that's what I heard, the last I heard was that the Italians wanted it back.
No doubt.
This is ours, it's Da Vinci, it's ours.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the Russians are still looking for 1 million pieces that were taken from the Hermitage. So, yeah, of course they want their stuff. But there were arguments over the Iceman. Because they said, no, it was the Italian Alps, no, it was the Austrian Alps. Good thing they didn't have the body to.
So where did it wind up going? Where did it wind up going?
Italian Alps.
Italian.
Yeah, the Italians own it. Yeah. And actually, I don't know if you're aware of the Cold Spring Harbor Labs.
Yeah.
Over in Cold Spring Harbor, there are these genetics labs where people actually win Nobel Prizes for what they do. And they were sent the copy machines that make, the 3D copy machines that make plastic models. They made a plastic model of, his name is Ogsi. They made a plastic model of him, and then they painted him up and they sent it to Cold Spring Harbor, and they had it on display for a while. So I think it's an amazing, they know so much about him. That they had the contents of his stomach, they knew that he had an ulcer, he had, what else did he have? He had terrible arthritis. Originally they thought that the tattoos were some way that they treated his arthritis with like acupuncture. And, but they're not really sure about that. So, they'll be finding out things about him forever, till they find the next one. The next ones are the Peruvian, the virgins, they're mummies. They're young women mummies found in Peruvian caves in the mountains, sacrificed for whatever it was, the growing season, or whatever they sacrificed those poor girls for. So, but yeah. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.